do you pronounce this?
Nc'nean?
I would pronounce it Nc'nean. Yeah, Nc'nean.
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 It's Nc'nean.
Nc'nean.
Hi, Annabel. Thank you for taking your time for the interview. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, perfect. So I am Annabel. I am the CEO and founder of Nc'nean Distillery, which is based up on the west coast of Scotland. I used to be a strategy consultant in London, is my background, and I left my job there in 2013 to start working on what would become Nc'nean. So it's been a long journey so far. We're 7 years in and we only just have whiskey, but it's been an awesome one. So yeah, that is me.
Right, cool. So what was the strategy consulting before? What kind of job was that?
It was with a company called Bain & Company, who are one of the big global strategy consulting firms. I focused mostly on retail and consumer products, so sort of vaguely relevant to whiskey, but actually
Cool, okay.
not that transferable when it comes to
And how did Scotch become interesting for you? When did the interest come?
So the distillery is on my family's farm, and it was originally that was, I guess, what sparked the very original idea. It was very much a family idea. The distillery is built in these old farm buildings, and I think you can't really help but be in Scotland without thinking about whiskey. But when it became really interesting for me was I took some time off from my previous job because they allowed you some unpaid leave, which was wonderful. And I said to my family, well, I'll write the business plan for the distillery while I'm off, which was a nice excuse to do some traveling and go and visit some distilleries. So as part of that, I did a 2 or 3 day trip to Islay because there's lots of distilleries in a small space there. Kilchoman are there, and at the time, this was back in 2011 or 2012, they were one of the only small distilleries. So we went to see them and lots of the other distilleries on Islay at the same time, and I felt like that was the first time that I really engaged with what a lot of Scotch distilleries were saying, and I felt that there was something missing that maybe we could bring to the industry, which was to focus much more on sustainability. And the second, because I heard nobody talking about sustainability when I did these trips, and the second was to just bring, I guess, a different way of thinking about creating the products. What I was told on all of those tours is we're doing things the way they've always been done, which there's absolutely a place for in Scotch, but there's also a place for not thinking like that. And that was when it really became clear to me, well, yeah, there's something I really want to do here. And I think actually it's really important for the industry as a whole, as well as fun.
And how does your family see the decision for the project Nc'nean?
Yeah, well, I hope they're very supportive. My dad is still really involved, not on a day-to-day basis, but he's a director and he sits on the board. But he's also involved because it's his farm where the cows are that eat the draff, for example. So it's a very close relationship, and one of our distillers is married to his farm manager. It's a very integrated feeling team in that sense as well. So
I think
so yeah, I think they're super supportive, and it's been pretty cool to see something go from derelict farm buildings to a working distillery that now has whiskey in the world. So
absolutely. And how did the construction of the distillery proceed? What were the major problems that had to be solved for you?
Yes, construction projects are definitely my least favorite bit of the job, and we're just embarking on another one to build another warehouse. So construction was challenging for a couple of reasons. One is we are really remote, and as soon as you try and construct anything remotely, it's a problem. You forget one kind of nail and it's like a 3-hour round trip. But also because we were trying to do things differently. So for example, we have a cooling pond, which is how we cool our stills. It saves loads of water. 80% of the water use in a distillery is cooling water rather than the water that ends up in your bottle. but no one else has really done this. Other people have cooling ponds, but they're generally used just as a holding area before you put the water back into the river. And we wanted to just circulate through it basically. And things like trying to find an engineer who could tell us how big to make this pond was very difficult. And then actually making the pond was also very difficult, because we thought we could just dig it and it would hold water, because we've done that elsewhere on the farm and it's been fine. But in this location, it didn't work. So then we had to line it and drain it. And so things like that, trying to get the road access is very narrow. It's just a single track road. The biomass boiler that we have is massive. So trying to work out how to get the boiler down the road was very tricky as well. So yeah, lots of challenges.
Okay, so yeah, I saw that after the ferry, it's 1 hour of drive on the really slightly road, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And we had to have a robust discussion, shall we say, with the Austrian and German suppliers of this boiler kit, because they wanted to bring the massive trucks that go on the autobahns all the way to the distillery, and we just had to say, no, you can't. And eventually the main contractor said, I will send the police to the ferry and stop you if you try to do this. You must go to this hauliers depot and change the lorry.
Okay. And before the construction, you chose LH Stainless as the manufacturer of your pot stills. What was the decision-making process like? Was it just the long wait at Forces that brought you there, or?
Yeah, it was partly that. Forsyths at the time were in a really difficult position. They had a long wait, but it was really hard to work with them as a result. Sometimes they would have a slot, but it would be like, well, you need to tell us by tomorrow if you want it. And of course, when you're buying £1 million worth of equipment, you can't make it as literally a decision overnight. And we found LH Stainless through our process engineers who had done the design. And I went and met Gary and Stuart, and at the time Jim Swan was alive, who was advising us, and he came with me, and I just got a really good feeling from them. They're very proactive, very professional. They just started Speyside Copper Works, which is their copper arm. The copper, I was a little, I guess, it was a bit nerve-wracking because no one had used them to do a whole distillery before. So it was definitely a leap of faith, but I felt like I trusted them, and Jim trusted them as well, and said, I think
cool.
Yeah, they can do the job. So we just thought, yeah, that sometimes you just have to go with something that feels right, even if it feels like a big risk as well. So that's what we did. And I'm so glad we did it, because they were absolutely fantastic. And of course, when you take a risk on something like that, it was really important for them to get it right. Because this would be the showcase project for everybody else. So it's been a brilliant relationship, and they've quoted on some more work that we need done now, and yeah, I'm super happy.
Cool. And I saw that they use your distillery as the showcase project and the image movie for their copper stills. That's cool.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, for them, that was also why they did it, right? They needed, this is what they were trying to do, and they need that. We've done it.
Nice.
So, but it worked for both of us, so it was great.
Okay, so the inspiration for a distillery name, Nc'nean, sorry for my wrong pronunciation, I think, was an ancient Gaelic goddess. And you changed the name 1 or 2 times. What was the process behind? I see that the apostrophe was first placed after the second N and then moved to after the C.
Exactly, and somewhere here, I still have an old bottle with the old apostrophe, just for old time's sake. We can't see it with the anyway. So the name, so we had a working name to begin with, which was Nc'nean. That's the place name. It was never going to be the name of the distillery, but you have to set a company up and you have to find a name. So we just used that, knowing that we would then go on to name ourselves properly. But I was the only person doing the project for the first 4 years. So you just have to focus on the most important thing at the time, which was fundraising and then building, and then you can think about naming after that. The reason for the apostrophe change, so we, as you rightly said, the name is based on Nc'nean, which is this super long word, 13 letters, really hard to spell, really hard to say. So we wanted to shorten it down. We put the apostrophe in in the original place in the middle between the N and the E, because that's where we took most of the letters out. And the point of the apostrophe was to say this is the kind of reference Nc'nean and say it's based on a much longer word. But what we didn't realise, this is one of the many things you learn when you set up a business, is that it completely confused people.
Mm-hmm.
And people thought it was Nc'nean Ian, or anyway.
Okay.
It was just way too confusing, and nobody could pronounce it. And still, Nc'nean is not that easy to pronounce, but it's better than Nc'nean Ian. So we thought, look, it's hard to pronounce. We've got it wrong. Would be much better to change it before we bring the whiskey out, because every step you take, there's everywhere. So we just thought, right, let's do it, and we did it.
Okay, cool.
That was it.
That's a really interesting story. And
one of the many learnings. If I build a distillery ever again, I won't make that mistake again.
Yeah, it was for First Nc'nean Distillery or something like that, as you said, right?
Yeah, exactly. But that was never really meant to be public. That was just the legal kind of name.
Project name.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And how did you choose your team around Nc'nean?
Well, it kind of happens organically. Like, we're always growing. We're recruiting actually at the moment. We have now, what are we now? I think we have 10 people now, which is pretty exciting. The team at the distillery, we have Gordon, who's our distillery manager. He came from Oban. So we didn't necessarily sort of specify to begin with, it must be someone from a nearby distillery. But we've ended up with someone from one of the nearest distilleries, which is fantastic from our point of view. He loves the West Coast, so it really suits him well, and he's brilliant at his job, so it suits us well as well. And then a lot of the other team at the distillery, each one has a different story, basically.
Okay.
So Lorna, who's one of our distillers, we recruited with. So effectively, my father and I recruited her and her husband jointly. Her husband does the farming for my father, and Lorna does the distilling for us. So,
okay.
But actually, when we first recruited Lorna, it wasn't necessarily clear that she would do the distilling role. We thought about her doing the visitor role or other roles, but initially she did the heroic job of looking after all the builders for a year and a half. They were all accommodated on site, and it was like cooking for them, cleaning, changing sheets, everything. It was just, she did a brilliant job of it. And through that process, sort of thought, well, maybe I would like to actually try my hand at the distilling. So she'd never done it before. She never had any involvement in whiskey, and she learned from scratch. So yeah, everyone has a different story, basically. But the common theme is that generally, with the exception of Gordon and now our brand ambassador, Matt, not many people have experience in whiskey.
Okay.
Which hasn't been intentional. It's not like I go out and say you mustn't have experience in whiskey. It's just been the way it's worked out. Right people come along at the right time. So.
And a bunch of motivation.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Exactly.
Okay, you're already doing an immense effort on sustainability. So efficiency in water use, sustainable energy with bulb, or even not using chemicals in the office are just a few examples.
Yeah.
Are there any major restrictions for you, for example, in production? And do you already have further plans in this direction of sustainability?
Yes, we always have plans. The ease of implementing them varies quite significantly. There is one massive restriction we have, which I would really like to see changed, which is the restriction that single malt can only be bottled in Scotland. And I understand why it was done. It was to protect Scottish jobs, and that is a great and really important part of what we do is actually creating jobs in the small area that we're in. That's part of our mission. But having said that, sustainability, I think, has now become more important to the world globally than exactly where a job is. Glass bottle. So our glass bottle is made of 100% recycled material. That reduces its carbon footprint by 40%, but it is still a glass bottle. And what we would really like to be able to do is send bulk, for example, to France or Germany, and have some people do the refill and have actual consumers bring their bottle back and refill it. It would be so much more efficient, but we're not allowed to do that at the moment under the Scotch whisky regs. So that I see as a massive problem. And there are lots of other ideas we have. Generally, the issue that we come across is that the technology tends to be developed at scale and only is cost effective. And I'm talking about it could be anaerobic digestion, it could be carbon capture, like all of these technologies are developed at massive scale and just aren't cost effective for a small distillery like us to employ. So that's the main barrier we come across to improving things. That's
also an interesting approach to send bulks to all the countries, because it would be so amazing or such a better efficiency.
Yeah, exactly. So much better. And you could offer, especially for the on-trade, you can offer much better prices. But yeah, it's not allowed at the moment. Yeah, exactly. The handling, everything, it would be so much more efficient, but we can't do it. And it would be great to, also to be able to collaborate with some of our retailers in Scotland, or well, in Scotland technically you can do it, but in London, and say, look, here you can literally come and refill your bottle and get a discount or whatever. We've looked at other options like getting people to send their bottles back to us, but that's inefficient. It uses transport miles and packaging, and so
that's also a really interesting idea, to refill your bottle you already have. But
and so one of the things that we're working on is getting the right refill packaging at the moment. So hopefully by the end of this year we'll have something so that people from our website could buy a refill instead of a bottle and then put it into the bottle they've got. So that's okay. That is a good solution for people who buy directly from us. But we need to find the right refill that is recyclable.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's come to your spirit. What makes your spirit for you, and how is it different?
So one of the things I have always been really focused on is the spirit itself, and by that I mean the spirit that we produce before we put it into casks. I don't know why, but I feel like a lot of maybe whiskey overall, but in particular a lot of Scotch, focuses too much on casks. And of course they're really important in bringing flavour, and it wouldn't be whiskey without them. But I think the spirit side of things is really, really interesting. And I think that was sort of subtly part of Jim Swan's philosophy. So Jim Swan was involved with us from really the very beginning, from maybe a couple of years even before I left my job to focus on it. So he's been very influential in how we make the whiskey, and helped us. So I would say that our kind of defining features are a very light and fruity spirit, and that's very much his style. The whiskey that we have out at the moment is matured in 65% STR red wine casks and 35% bourbon, and that is also very much influenced by Jim and what he recommended. But beyond that, we also run lots of experiments, and they have been to date very focused on the spirit side of things. So I'm completely fascinated by fermentation and the impact that yeast has, which is amazing. No one really plays around with yeast very much in the distilling industry, but in beer, it's central. So I felt like, why do people in beer really care about this, but no one's thinking about it in whiskey? So in future years, when they're ready, we'll hopefully have some interesting yeast experiments to release as well.
Yeah, that would be another question. You work already with different yeasts. Which yeast species are these? And is this purely experimental, or?
Yes, it's purely experimental. We choose different yeasts, not every year. We do sometimes repeat some yeasts. But we try and source different. So every yeast is developed by the yeast manufacturers for a purpose. It's a whiskey distilling yeast, or it's a rum yeast, or it's a wine yeast for this kind of wine. So we work with our yeast suppliers to supply a range of interesting yeasts to us, basically. And initially we do them literally in buckets. We call them our little aliens. So in 5-litre buckets in the distillery. And we just run the fermentation stage, not the distillation stage. And we just do basic checks, like how does it taste as a wash, and also how much alcohol does it produce. And then for the ones that we both seem to work from an alcohol production point of view and taste nice, then we scale up and do 2 weeks of production in the distillery.
Cool.
Um,
And you don't make peaty spirit, do you?
we don't. Using peat doesn't really fit very well with our sustainability credentials. It's even in small quantities, we shouldn't really be digging out peat and burning it because it's a massive carbon sink. So we don't do that at all. But also, I guess philosophically, one of the things that I want to do is bring new consumers into Scotch. And I think that peat can be one of those things that's a little bit scary to people. So
I see.
it works
Okay.
from that point of view as well.
You also sell whole casks directly. How does the buying process work, and what choices do I have if I buy one?
So Cindy, who is our office manager, but really office manager doesn't encompass most of what she does. She does everything. She's like the linchpin of the whole distillery, is also in charge of our cask sales. So we sell 60 a year, and you can choose from 3 different barrel types. So we have a sherry, STR and a bourbon. You can choose how long you want to mature it for, and that can be flexible also as you go. We fill it for you. You get to taste it. You get to come and visit it in non-COVID times, which is kind of the best bit.
And do I have a choice, or can I choose different spirit types, or is it just one spirit? Or
so we run 2. We don't include the yeast experiments in the cask program because they're experiments, and I would never want to sell something to somebody that we don't necessarily know those 2 weeks are going to turn into good spirit. But we do have these 2 different recipes that we run in the distillery. We call them young and old, and they are designed for different ages of release. So everything that we are bottling right now is our so-called young recipe. So that's the real kind of, it's everything you'd expect. It's got very clear worts in the mash tun. It's got 2 yeasts for extra flavor development in the fermentation stage. It's got quite high cut points in the stills. So light and fruity, and produces a great young whiskey. About 10% of our production goes into what we call our old recipe, which is designed to mature for basically at least 10 years. We advise most of our cask owners to go for the young recipe, because if you decide you want to bottle it after 8 years, your old recipe is not going to be ready. But there are a few people who choose the old recipe, and because they know they want to wait for 15 years or something. So that's also an option open to people.
And if I bought a cask, how often do you send and sample? 1 or 2 times a year, or per request?
We do it on request, because some people, we find it, and initially we thought we would do it once a year, but actually we find some people just want the spirit to stay in the cask for the first 6 years. So we're kind of we were taking 100 ml out of their cask for no reason. So we've actually changed that just recently to move to a kind of request basis. So for the people who want regular ones, they can ask us. If you don't, we just leave it sleeping in there, and you can see how it develops later on.
Okay. And where are your casks located? Which warehouse do you use? Is it on site or remotely?
Most of them are on site. In theory, they should all be on site.
Okay.
But we're in a phase right now where we have we ran out of space in our previous warehouse, and we're still waiting to build our new warehouse. But all private casks are on site. So currently we're storing some of the Nc'nean Distillery casks off-site in Glasgow. Annoyingly, because we are organic certified, we have to find an organic certified warehouse to store them in.
Okay.
So they have to go all the way to Glasgow, but yeah, all the private ones are and will be stored on site, and we're just in the process of starting the build of new warehouses.
Okay. Will single cask be released for different countries?
We are planning some single casks. So we're just kind of trying to nail down at the moment what our special releases will look like. We'll probably do a couple of special releases a year of not single casks, like just special editions of something. The yeast experiments would be a good example of what might fit into that in future. And then we will also do some single casks, either just we found a great cask and we release it on our own, or we'll do it as a collaboration with a retailer or a distributor or something. So yes, we already have a couple of plans for that for this year.
Okay, and you've talked about the composition of 65% STR wet blend cask and 35 ex-bourbon. Is there any difference between the composition of the Nc'nean, the inaugural release, and the batches?
No, but Nc'nean was much smaller.
Okay.
So the batches are 5,000 bottles, which means you get 15 casks. Nc'nean was just 5 casks. So there's a tiny little bit of like mathematical difference, but also that does make a difference how many casks you put into a batch, right?
Okay.
And of course, Nc'nean was also cask strength. So.
And you're currently running various batches. We are at batch 4, I think. What are the plans for the future? For example, annual specifications, 6-year-old, 10-year-old, or similar?
So our plan is to sort of continue what we're doing. So we will always have the Nc'nean organic single malt whiskey, but it will obviously evolve over time, partly because our stock will get older, and partly because the stock will get older per se, right? So every single barrel will change, but also we will probably change that mix over time. And that is because different cask type mature at different rates. So the bourbons mature more slowly than the STRs, the sherries mature even more slowly than either of those. So at the moment we have no sherry in there, but I do see us it's never going to be a sherry heavy whiskey, but we might start adding a little bit of sherry in. We will slightly increase the batch sizes hopefully later this year as well, which is just because as part of building the new warehouse, we're also building a bottling building, and that will have a much bigger vat in it. So it will just allow us to do slightly bigger bottlings, which is just a bit more practical and efficient. And then, so that will always this is our kind of early example, I guess, of what our core will be. It will get older. I'm not a huge fan of age statements. I think they can also slightly unnecessarily detract from a lot of the other aspects of the whiskey, but we will always be completely transparent about, to the extent we can within the regulations, about what's in there. So I don't envisage having a 6-year-old, but we will at some stage probably get to the stage where most of the whiskey in the bottle is a 6-year-old. And then in the distant future, we will also be doing something with this old recipe that I just mentioned. So, but that's still at least 7 years away, maybe more.
Okay.
And at the moment, I don't know what we'll do with that. We might bottle it as a special bottling on its own. We might actually think, what the best thing to do with that is to blend it into our existing core expressions, just to add a different dimension to it. So who knows? That's part of the fun of the
Absolutely.
Of the process of waiting.
Absolutely. Okay, one last question I have. You're certified by the Biodynamic Association, the BDA, and the Demeter and BDA have their roots in anthroposophy, the biodynamic way of working first conceived by Rudolf Steiner. And beyond using certified barley, do you use other approaches from the BDA, and what is your position to anthroposophy?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Initially, I had really hoped that we would be able to use biodynamic barley, either as part of or as a majority of what we did. But it turned out to be much harder to source it than we expected. And we couldn't find any biodynamic growers in Scotland. And so then you have this trade-off between, well, biodynamics is super interesting, and I actually think it's kind of, there are elements of it that I think are probably more the future than just organic per se. But on the other hand, I'm not interested in sourcing barley from miles and miles and miles away from the distillery. So you have this trade-off. So philosophically, we find it really interesting, but practically we haven't actually been able to use it yet. So we just use certified organic at the moment.
Okay, and what do you think about, or what is your position to anthroposophy? What do you think about that?
I think, to be honest, I'm not an expert on it, but I think philosophically it's brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to make a lot of sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it just seems to be a slightly more holistic way of doing things than organic is alone. I think organic is a significant improvement on traditional, well, conventional farming, should we call it?
Mm-hmm.
But I think biodynamic just adds another layer, most of which seems to make sense. But whether it's ever something we'll be able to include at scale in what we do, I don't know.
Okay, that's it. And I want to wish you all of my heart the best for your project, Nc'nean.
Thank you very much.
Only the best for your team. It is an absolutely great way you go, from my perspective. And hopefully we can taste many more whiskies from you.
Exactly. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to chat.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.